Okay, so I think I'm circulating a roll. Let me just real quickly go over a few of the questions. So again, it's answer one of these, type double space within 1.5 to 3 pages. I'm not going to display this just for time purposes. We went over Augustine. It's there in your book. How do Platonic views help him to formulate a response to the problem of evil, a response that reconciles God's goodness with the existence of evil in the world and God's all-powerfulness. And this is sometimes called the absence theory. I forget whether your book uses the term, but the idea is that evil is really the absence of good, right? And so pretty much, what kinds of evil, meaning natural evils or moral evils, are best accounted for by the absence theory. Can it account for moral evil? Is evil that is done by virtue of the free decision of human beings to do evil, right? Natural evil is like what we just had out there in California, a week and a half ago, a mudslide. You could say, what an evil befell those poor people who died in there. And so, and your book goes into a bit of a discussion of how sin relates to this. So if you want to bring that in, look at your book's discussion on that. I don't have anything on the review sheet or the PowerPoint on that. Actually, there was no PowerPoint. There is, if a PowerPoint is a good, there is a lack of a good on Augustine, on evil. Well, actually, there isn't. You know what? That's right. There was a little bit that I showed you from that Hick PowerPoint. I think I made that visible to you. I'll look and see. But there's not going to be a lot on that on the test. So I wouldn't dwell on that unless you want to write a question on it. Number 2 is on the fifth way, right? We did this so recently. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the idea that things that lack intelligence need a designer to enable them to fulfill the purposes that they do, an intelligent designer. Hence, if there are things in nature that fit that bill, they needed God as their master designer. And and when I bring in, and relevant to 2 is also stuff like, does Hume seem to you to be correct when he talks about an unknown causal principle in matter? So 2 is a question where you can bring in some of the stuff on the Hume PowerPoint against the design argument. Number 3 is on the ontological argument. You can do one or other of those, and we're going to review those. But Descartes' view that says that God is the sum of all perfections, existence is a perfection, so God necessarily exists. Or Anselm's view that says that God is the greatest being we conceive of or imagine, and So in order to qualify as that, God has to exist in reality and not just as a mental concept. But I asked you to specifically get in there and explain how the fool, the denier of God's existence, would end up in a contradiction, by accepting the premises of the ontological argument in either version and denying the conclusion. Okay. Number 4 asks you to get in and decide whether you could just go on the design argument, as somebody like Cleanthes in Hume's dialogue wants to do, and as a result, conclude that basically God has anthropomorphic properties, human-like properties, and make the kind of conclusion that both Cleanthes and Aquinas want to make, that God is the God of the Bible, just from the design argument. Because of course Hume says no, you can't, and he brings a number of reasons why that argument can have more than one conclusion to it. 5, I didn't know whether to add it or not, but if somebody's interested in getting down and dirty with geometry there, you can, and Socrates' claim about the pre-existence of the soul. We looked at that in the video, and kind of went over the basics of that, what Socrates thinks it would prove if the boy can answer questions about geometry, having never been taught it. It's basically the reason it's in this section is Descartes' a rationalist, but this was maybe the first really good statement of rationalism and of innate ideas, the claim that we have innate knowledge from birth, in Western literature, in Western philosophy. Okay, 6 is stuff we covered real recently. Whether you agree or disagree with Descartes' claim that there aren't any sure marks that would distinguish dreaming from waking. And not surprisingly, I get people coming down on both sides of this issue. And what counts is, at least from my perspective as a grader, is not necessarily which end of this you take, whether you agree with Descartes or disagree with him, but what reasons you present to support whatever side you take. 7 basically wants you to go look at methodic doubt, methodological skepticism, hyperbolic doubt, his method, and what you think of it. 7, you'd basically follow the presentation in the PowerPoint, I guess. So 8 and 9, 8 is different in the previous one. 8 concerns the mind-body problem. You can look at that online. But again, I'll probably repeat that question on the final. But 8 basically says discuss 2 of the following virtues: courage, generosity, honesty, or loyalty, and how Aristotle can portray them as a mean between extremes. And do you think somebody really will fare better in life if they cultivate these sorts of virtues, as Aristotle claims they would? Number 9 was Aristotle correct? And are they needed by everyone or just a few? Your book book gets into a controversial part of Aristotle's philosophy that the elite are the ones who can be really virtuous and cultivate these qualities. But is it just an elite few that need them? Number 9 has to do with Aristotle's claim that we can develop character traits, good character traits, virtues, in us by habitually performing actions of the sort, that relate to the character trait we want to develop, by making temperate choices to develop self-control or temperance, by making the courageous choices to develop, a more courageous disposition. So, okay. So that's what they concern, and that's a little bit of a review. Because what I said is I used to not do a review sheet. I would tell people, look, common sense tells you if I think an area of what we studied is important enough to write or to construct an essay question on, it also is an area where I would, develop an objective question, or at least could, and so need to look at the essay question and say, well, what kind of factual material that could be covered in an objective question does this contain? I'm going to go through the ontological argument pretty quickly because I want to spend a little time on Aristotle. Let me tell you why the part on Aristotle is so long. Basically, and I've used this for a while, this is the outline version of the Aristotle PowerPoint. That's why it's so long. I thought, well, how can I really do better than that in the review sheet? So I just cut and pasted the outline version of. So what you have basically in the Aristotle section of your review sheet is all of the verbal content of the Aristotle's Ethics PowerPoint, right there. Okay. Well, again, a priori means prior to and independent of experience, and a posteriori means after or based on experience. And we didn't do too much about cosmological arguments, but the first two, cosmological arguments that God has to be the necessary first cause of the universe, rely on observations about the world to get going, so they are a posteriori. And so is the design argument, a teleological argument. It requires us to look around at the world and see that there seem to be things in nature that have parts that work together to serve a purpose. The ontological argument, by contrast, though, is a priori. It's totally abstract, and it does not depend on any observations about the world. It gets its start not from observations about the world, but from a concept of God's being. And that's where we get the term ontological. Ontos in Greek is the Greek word for existence or being with a capital B. And so the argument, its starting point is a concept of who God is, God's being. And of course, the one that Anselm works with is God is that than which none greater can be thought. The one that Descartes works with is God is the most perfect being, the supremely perfect being. Well, of course, the fool is the person who denies God's existence. The fool has said in his heart there is no God. And so the fool contradicts himself. In the first one, if you accept the claim that God is the greatest being we can think of, well, Anselm tries to show us that if God did not exist in reality, then we would be able to think of a greater being. So if God exists in reality and not in the mind, then God is greater, right? And so if the concept you're working with is the concept of God as the greatest possible being we can imagine, well, in order to qualify as that, God has to exist. If he existed only as a concept of the mind, then he wouldn't be the greatest possible being. We could think of a greater being. So the fool would contradict himself on the one hand to say, well, okay, Anselm, I accept your description of God as the greatest possible being, but I hold that that being does not exist in reality, but only as a concept in the mind. Well, Anselm would say, well, then you're not talking about the greatest possible being, because the greatest possible being has to exist in reality and not just as a mental concept. And so you're contradicting yourself by denying that the greatest possible being exists in reality. And of course, to kind of get ahead of myself, for Descartes' one, the idea is if you're accepting Descartes' claim that God, according to biblical tradition, is the most supreme being, the most supremely perfect being, then you're saying that God is the sum of all perfections, all perfect qualities. God possesses all perfect qualities, and existence is one of those perfect qualities. So the fool would contradict himself to say, okay, Descartes, I will agree in theory with your concept of God as the supremely perfect being, but I don't think that being exists in reality. But he says, well, wait a second. I thought you said you agreed with me that God's the supremely perfect being. In order to be the supremely perfect being, he has to possess all perfections, existence being one of those perfections. So God must necessarily exist. So you contradict yourself by accepting the definition of God as the supremely perfect being, and at the same time denying that God has existence as one of those perfect qualities that God possesses. And then, of course, we saw that Kant takes existence out of the list by saying existence isn't just a property of a thing. Now that gets ahead, but I thought I'd just kind of explain where the contradiction lies. Why does the fool contradict himself? So again, the greatest imaginable being has to exist in reality, not just as a concept, because if God existed just as a concept, then you could imagine a greater one that existed in reality as well. Behind this is Plato's assumption about existence, that something that exists or exists to a greater degree is greater than something that does not exist. So a God that exists in reality is necessarily greater than one that exists only as a concept in the mind. So, in order to be the greatest being we can think of, God can't exists just as a concept in the mind, but needs to exist in reality. So if the fool accepts Anselm's definition of God, Anselm would say also has to accept the conclusion that if God is the greatest being we can imagine, God has to exist in reality and not just as a concept. So God exists. Now, Guanillo's reply is, as I said before, an argument form. It's of the same form as the original argument. We call this a refutation by logical analogy. I'm not going to ask you that term because this is not logic class, but the idea is you develop a parallel argument that easily that is such that you can easily see there's something really wrong with this argument. And that's what he does. He says, well, look, Guanillo says, look, I could just as easily, using the same reasoning you're using, Anselm, prove the existence of the greatest possible island we can think of. I can prove that island, in order to qualify as the greatest island we can imagine, must exist in reality. It's got to actually be out there somewhere and not just exist as a concept in the mind. And by the way, folks, I wouldn't go down to the cruise ship line, try to book a cruise to that island on spring break. There are problems with being able to prove that, right? In other words, it seems very odd that from mere thought we should be able to prove that in reality that island is out there somewhere. And so the conclusion is supposed to be, well, okay, and so shouldn't that make us think twice about the kind of reasoning that says just from the concept of God as the greatest being we can imagine, we can prove that God is out there in reality. And Anselm's reply is one that Descartes kind of takes and runs with, and that's that somehow existence is so essential to God's nature, and we see Descartes running with this, saying existence is as essential a property to God as having three sides and three angles is essential to being a triangle. And so, the idea is that if that's so, but existence is not a necessary property of the most perfect island, then Anselm would say, Guanillo, you're wrong. The argument works for God. It does not work for the most perfect island simply because existence is an essential part of God's nature in the way that it's not of the most perfect island. But still, if I don't think that reply works, because if you're working with the basic Platonic concept of existence, then you should be able to run the argument the same. At least that's always been my take on it, that Anselm's reply doesn't really hold water. But Descartes runs with that. And so we've done some of Descartes' theory of knowledge, and so you saw that when Descartes comes across his cogito ergo sum, his I think therefore I am, after he's got that, what does he know? What can he prove? Well, the only thing at that point in his technical philosophy that he can justify is his own existence as a thinking thing. But Descartes wants to prove the existence of God and that God is no deceiver, because if he can prove that, he can get back what he questioned in the beginning. He can get back the real world and other people. But how's he going to prove God's existence from facts about the world when at this point the only thing Descartes can defend is the claim that he exists, not that the world exists? Well, so the bottom line there, the reason for going off on that tangent is Descartes has got to use some kind of an a priori argument to prove God's existence. He can't use something like the design argument or the cosmological argument, that arguments that are a posteriori and depend on observations about the world, because he doesn't even know if the world is there, right, in reality. And so one of the arguments he uses, and he uses a couple of others which we're not even going to worry about, is the ontological argument, you know. And so, well, so the concept of God's being that Descartes uses is that God is the supremely perfect being. And so he claims that a part of God's attributes as the being who possesses all perfect qualities is that God must possess existence as one of those perfect qualities. And so it's putting existence into the description of God's qualities that makes existence a logical predicate. When you predicate something, you say it has a particular quality. This chalkboard is black. I'm predicating blackness of the chalkboard. Blackness becomes a logical predicate. Well, if I predicate existence of God, I'm saying that existence is a property of God, like being all-powerful, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, etc. And it's putting existence into that list of God's qualities that makes it a contradiction for the fool, for the denier of God's existence, to accept the concept of God as the most perfect being and deny God's existence, because in accepting the concept of God as the being that has all perfect qualities, you've just accepted that God possesses existence. So that to then go on and deny existence to God, you're contradicting yourself. So what Kant did, though, was he said, look, existence isn't just a quality of a thing, like being brown or black is a quality of the blackboard, but existence functions entirely differently. First, we talk about how we describe something, the qualities it has. And then we afterwards talk about whether the thing that we're describing exists or doesn't exist, but existence is not one of the qualities. As Kant puts it, it's a precondition. It is a condition something has to satisfy to have any qualities, that it exists. In other words, my car has to exist in order to have any of the other qualities it has, being blue, having a four-cylinder engine, an automatic transmission, da-da-da-da-da-da. If it didn't exist, it wouldn't have any of those qualities. And so Descartes says possessing existence is like a triangle possessing three angles. We can't even conceive of a triangle without three angles. We can't even conceive of God except as existing. But Kant says, well, yes, if I think of a triangle, I have to think of it as having three angles. I can't not do that. But if I reject the existence of the entire triangle, I reject its sides, angles, everything. and there's no contradiction in doing that. Similarly, Kant says we can deny God's existence without contradicting ourselves. And if that is the case, then the ontological argument does not prove its conclusion. We can accept the premises as true and deny the conclusion if existence functions differently, not as a logical predicate, but as a precondition of a thing's having any predicable properties, any properties we can talk about. Okay, well, so that's that part of the review sheet. If anybody came in, these are on top. You feel free to grab one if you didn't already do so. Well, we did the cosmological argument really recently, so I'll go through this pretty quickly. Right, this is Aquinas' fifth way. The other four are not the design argument. Again, it says, why can't things in nature direct themselves toward a goal? Because they need an intelligence, an external intelligence to direct them. Telos, again, is the Greek word for an end or goal. That's why the design argument is called the teleological argument. It runs from the assumption that things in nature fulfill a goal or purpose or function, and then it says, well, they needed a designer to design that into them to fulfill that function. Paley's watch needed a designer to make the wheels and everything work so that it could be used for telling time. And an arrow needs an intelligent archer to direct it toward its end at the target. So who fulfills this need, basically? God. Because the analogy goes, well, and don't things in nature have parts that work together to fulfill a function just like the watch? And so if the watch needed a designer to design it so that those parts work together to fulfill the function of enabling us to use it to tell time, shouldn't something like the eye that has parts that work together to fulfill the function of enabling us to use it to see with, shouldn't the eye need an intelligent designer to design it so that the parts work together to fulfill that function? And so who would the designer of the eye be other than God is basically how the argument goes. And I don't have, and I probably did, but I didn't put it on. So I don't have Hume's criticisms of the design argument, but you've got the PowerPoint there, and you can review some of what he says about it. Now, we did that really recently. As I said, for folks who walked in, there's a slight difference between the question pool that I am giving out this morning, and this is on the internet too, and the one that's on the internet. The question 8 on the one that's on the internet deals with mind-body problem. We're not going to get to that before test 2 because today we're doing just review. If you want to read up on it and answer that question, you can. The bottom line is there are 2 question 8s. Question 8 on the original sheet concerns the mind-body problem. I struck that out and put 2 Aristotle's ethics questions because for some reason I was thinking that we had done Aristotle's ethics on test 1. I think because my competent people did it on their test 1, and I got them confused. So we want to do some stuff in what remains on Aristotle's virtue ethics because it's been a little while. Again, intellectual virtues are theoretical virtues that studying things in theory. we're not worried so much about that as what he says about moral virtue. Again, he centers around the issue of what kind of person ought we to be, what character traits ought to be character traits that we have in order to be a virtuous person. He's not so much interested in the central question that most other moral theories are interested in. How do we figure out what's the right thing to do? What ought we to do in this situation? What's the moral thing to do? But as I said, we'll look at those theories later, and I may have to edit a few things out in order to get to them. Excuse me. And you basically, it's not an either-or proposition. Should ethics be concerned with character traits and their development, or should it be concerned with developing a theory of how you make correct moral decisions? Well, it's not really an either-or decision. You can have a moral theory that tells you what the right thing to do is, but do you have the character to follow through with it and, commit to your convictions? So I think it can be both and. But the interesting thing about Aristotle's virtue ethics is a lot of secular ethicists spend time on Aristotle because they think he said a lot of things that are still relevant today. So it's not just of historical value, So Aristotle thinks that virtues are character traits that can be acquired. And they're acquired by habitual action, like we acquire skill in playing a musical instrument. And sometimes these habits are contrary to nature. Nature tells us to make the scaredy cat decision, but if we're trying to develop a more courageous disposition, then we have to go against sometimes our natural tendencies. Or nature says, have that second piece of cake or pie. But if we're trying to develop self-control, we may have to go against nature and say, no, I'm going to, develop self-control in the area of, what I consume. So I'm going to go against my natural tendency to want that second piece of pie and punt on it and eat moderately. Okay. Or that third piece of pie, whatever. Where do we draw the line? So virtues then, for Aristotle, they're not acquired by some kind of private meditation on the form of the good. For Aristotle, there is no independently existing intellectual world where the forms exist. Aristotle does think that things in this world have genuine natures, and we can call them forms. Plato also thought that. In other words, Plato thought that not only is there the form of tableness in the intellectual world, the world outside the cave, but there also is in each particular table an instantiated version, an immanent version of the form of tableness. Aristotle holds that the second view is correct. Forms only exist in particular things, but the first part of it that Plato accepted is not. There is no independent world where the forms exist. But if that is the case for Aristotle, then it means there's no independent world where the form of the good with a capital G exists. So morality is not a matter of coming to know more fully and meditating on the form of the good or goodness itself. It's developing virtuous character traits that produce the end of a happier life. For Aristotle, the end of morality is a happier life here and now. Rather than worrying with Plato and Socrates about whether our chariots are going to, go up so that we can commune with the forms after death like Meno's slave boy did, right? So we acquire then virtues in community with other people by making decisions that exercise or develop those virtues. And again, we already said this, but we can learn other skills by habit. We learn to build by actually building things. We learn to play a musical instrument like the lyre by actually practicing and doing it. We develop virtuous character traits by making decisions consistent with those traits, by making courageous decisions if we want to develop courage, etc. So moral virtue for Aristotle is social. You don't develop these character traits by private meditation off in some monastery. We don't become morally just in isolation, but in community with other individuals. And a virtue then for Aristotle, and this is where he kind of breaks new ground, but we saw that even with the pre-Socratics, even with Heraclitus' view of the logos and ethics as centered around moderate behavior, we have this idea of the golden mean, that really the virtuous life and virtuous courses of action walk a middle ground between excess on the one hand and deprivation on the other, between too much and too little. It's kind of like Goldilocks, just right. Okay, so again, I'll repeat. These illustrations are in the PowerPoint. This part of the review sheet is just that part of the PowerPoint. The outline view. So a virtue then for Aristotle is the midpoint between two vices, a vice of excess and a vice of deprivation, and the virtue is the mean or midpoint. It, like temperance, is the mean between asceticism, in other words, too little, denial of your body's needs for food and drink, and self-indulgence or gluttony, too much, excess on the other hand, right? But temperate behavior is behavior that recognizes and fulfills your body's need for food, but does so in a moderate way, right? In a way that doesn't go to excess on one side or the other. Not too little, not too much. Likewise, courage is the midpoint between fearing everything, being, cowardice, and fearing nothing, foolhardiness, and courage is the midpoint between those extremes. And generosity is actually discussed in the video, and Aristotle discusses it. He does think that someone can be generous to a fault. We have that expression. You may have heard it before. He or she is generous to a fault. In other words, they're too generous. They put themselves in trouble by being too generous, too giving. So for Aristotle, that person is not necessarily virtuous. They have an excessive amount of generosity, right? And the other end is pretty much self-evident, right? You're not generous if you're Ebenezer Scrooge, right? If you have the vice of deprivation, if you don't want to give away your resources to help anybody else. And so the generous person is the person who walks the midpoint between those two. Okay, I know. I that's one reason why I record this. Kind of bang, 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 going through a lot of this, but you can replay it. So, achieving the mean is often done contrary to what our own disposition would tell us, right? We want to act fearfully, but if we're trying to develop courage, we have to make decisions that overcome that fearfulness and keep it in control, right? Courage is not having any fear. Aristotle believes that you can have fear and be courageous, but it's managing that fear and still being able to perform under it. I mean, it's amazing how many top athletes, top performers still get butterflies in their stomach before a concert or a big game, but you learn to manage that, that fear, right? And so, how do we do it? By using our reason to make those choices that allow us to walk that moderate mean. So reason is essential for us in terms of our ability to act morally. And Aristotle gets criticized by feminists, so do other moral theories, by saying, well, what if I help the family next door just because we've known them for years and we know they're going through hard times right now. The husband lost his job. There's been some illness. We're going to help them out just because we really love them, we care for them, and we feel for them in this situation. Now, why is that somehow a less moral motive for doing something good, helping them, than, as we'll see Kant says, helping them out because we think we have an abstract duty to be benevolent to our fellow man, making a decision entirely based on reason, And likewise for Aristotle, you got to be rational to be moral at the highest level. So, it raises issues. Aristotle, Plato would have some women be in the ruling class, the intellectual class. Aristotle is convinced that most women are not as rational as men, but that raises the issue of, can women be as moral as men if rationality is essential to acting morally, and women aren't as rational. So modern-day feminists criticize Aristotle for focusing so much on the essential nature of reason and the part it plays in developing virtuous character traits. Okay. Now, for Aristotle, the end of morality, then, is not mimicking or trying to be like goodness itself or the form of the good. Because there, let me go back and make this one point with reason. Again, Aristotle thinks that the essential qualities of a thing are the things that define its nature, and they're usually what's unique to that thing, right? I mean, the essential quality of this is that it needs to be something that holds liquids and keeps them hot. And if it does it well, for Aristotle, an inanimate object like a knife that performs its essential function well, like to cut, or in this case, to hold a liquid and keep it warm, does it, he uses the same word, arete, does it virtuously. So likewise, virtue for us has to do with fulfilling our central function, the central part of our nature. And what does Aristotle say that is? Well, it has to do with what separates us out from all other living things. And for Aristotle, that is possessing reason. We're reasoning beings in a way that's different in kind from everything else in nature. Now, after Darwin, it becomes harder to draw a sharp line between human reason and the reason of non-human animals like dolphins and border collies and higher primates. The claim is that there's a difference in degree, but not a difference in kind, post-Darwin, between animal rationality and our rationality. But for people like Aristotle and Kant, reason is the place where we can draw a sharp line between human beings and everything else. Okay. Well, we actually go to 9:25, don't we? I mean, still, but we're gonna well, at least I'm gonna finish up with Aristotle. We just did the meditations. I can ask if they're but so what is the end of morality for Aristotle if it is not mimicking goodness itself or the form of the good? Since there is no form of the good, the end of morality for Aristotle cannot be pursuing or mimicking the form of the good. For him, it's happiness in this life. That's, in other words, the question or the answer to the question why be moral for Aristotle is that virtue is its own reward, that being moral, developing virtuous character is going to give you a happier life here and now. So the virtuous life is the happiest life, but if the virtuous life is a life of moderation in all of our choices, then for Aristotle, the happiest life for a human being is a life of moderation, not going to too many extremes, like that poor guy who, the stuntman and extreme sport advocate who jumped off a mountain with one of these bird suits on and at night and hit a rock, the ledge that was jutting out and killed himself. Aristotle would say, well, he's not doing things in moderation here, folks. Okay. So virtue then is walking the moderate mean between extremes, and so the happiest life is a virtuous life. Any questions about Descartes on the Meditations? There's a little section to review on that, but we kind of already did it, and so okay. Well, I will supply the scantrons, or actually Governor O'Malley. Okay. But like I say, I know it's kind of wasteful to give you a 200 question scantron form for 25 questions, but that's what they provide me with. For some reason, that's all our department buys. BSSWE buys other ones, but we're not part of that anymore. We used to be part of social sciences, but then they kicked us into liberal arts, which actually is the right place for philosophy to be. I mean, in a big university like the University of Virginia, philosophy or graduate study in philosophy was in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, not in the, other things. So, okay, if you miss any of these on the way out, pick one up. And so, remember a number 2 pencil, but I'll certainly have some. So, and it looks like the roll missed some folks. So, sign the roll on the way out. And by the way, Pasta Mystic, great pizza in Towson. Yes. Thank them for that pen. Okay, let me stop this thing.